Under harsh grocery store lights, the scanner's beep echoed like a judge's gavel. Jessica Miller watched the numbers climb. $27.43 glowing mercilessly on the small screen. Her weathered fingers fumbled through 12 wrinkled bills, each one a reminder of double shifts that barely covered rent. The prescription formula sat between them like evidence of her failure. Chloe's Special Milk, the only brand that stopped her 3-year-old from crying through sleepless nights. "I'm so sorry," Jessica whispered, each word scraping her throat raw. We changed our minds about the milk." Behind her, footsteps shuffled, voices murmured. Heat crawled up her neck as Chloe's innocent question pierced the air. "Mommy, why can't we keep it?" Jessica's hand reached toward the canister, moving like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Then a voice, calm and certain, sliced through her humiliation. "I'll pay for everything she needs." A stranger in an expensive coat stepped from the shadows. Jessica's breath caught. His eyes weren't filled with pity. 3 weeks earlier, Jessica had stared at the same prescription paper, Dr. Henderson's handwriting like a death sentence, scrawled across white paper. Chloe's stomach condition required this specific formula. Nothing else would work. The doctor's words echoed in the cramped apartment that still smelled of last night's mac and cheese. Without it, she'll continue having severe digestive issues. The pain will only get worse. Jessica had nodded, clutching the prescription like a lifeline. She'd make it work somehow. She always did. The math was simple and brutal. $240 a month for formula. Her waitressing job at Murphy's Diner brought in maybe $800 on a good month. Rent ate up $550. Utilities took another $100. That left negative $10 for everything else. Food, gas, hope. Jessica had started skipping meals 3 months ago. Her uniform hung loose now, belts pulled to the last notch. But Chloe needed to eat. Chloe needed her special milk. In the mirror above their second-hand dresser, Jessica saw her grandfather's photograph watching her. Sergeant William Crawford, killed in Vietnam when she was just 5. His uniform was pristine in the faded image, chest decorated with medals her grandmother had explained in whispered stories. He'd saved 12 men during the Tet Offensive, carried them to safety while enemy fire rained down around him. A hero who never made it home. Her grandmother used to say his sacrifice meant something. That someday, someone would remember. The bills kept coming anyway. Late notices with red stamps. Final warnings. The formula prescription refills. Jessica worked doubles at the diner, her feet swelling in cheap shoes, pouring coffee for truckers who left dollar tips on $20 checks. She picked up cleaning jobs on weekends, scrubbing offices where executives made more in a day than she earned all month. Her phone stayed mostly silent now. Friends stopped calling when she couldn't afford movie nights or birthday dinners. Isolation settled around her like dust, but Christopher Adams had been watching. From his corner booth at Murphy's Diner, he'd noticed the young waitress who never ate during her shifts, the one who pocketed dinner rolls when she thought no one was looking. His daughter Madison sat across from him, coloring princesses, while he pretended to read the quarterly reports. In truth, he was watching Jessica refill coffee cups with mechanical precision, her smile never quite reaching her tired eyes. Something about her reminded him of the stories his father used to tell. Christopher's empire had grown from his grandfather's single hardware store into a pharmaceutical company worth $800 million. Adams Pharmaceuticals developed life-saving medications, but profit margins ruled every decision. He sat on boards, attended galas, wrote checks to charities that existed mainly for tax benefits. His penthouse overlooked the city like a throne room, all marble and glass and emptiness. Madison was his only joy, his only anchor to anything real. Her mother had died when she was 2, leaving them both adrift in a world of nannies and boarding schools. Late at night, when Madison slept and the city stretched endlessly below, Christopher would stare at his father's old military trunk. Inside, beneath layers of tissue paper, lay documents that told a different story. Letters from Vietnam, commendations, a folded flag. But most importantly, a photograph of 12 soldiers, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning despite the hell around them. One face had haunted him since childhood. The man who'd pulled his father from a burning helicopter. Sergeant William Crawford, the hero who'd died saving Christopher's father. The debt had followed him through Harvard Business School, through his first million, through every success that built his fortune. His father had lived because of Crawford's sacrifice. Christopher existed because a stranger had chosen to risk everything. The weight of unpaid gratitude pressed against his chest every morning when he looked in the mirror. He'd tried to find Crawford's family years ago, hiring private investigators who'd turned up nothing but dead ends and empty graves. The trail had gone cold in some forgotten small town. The hero had vanished into history. Until that Tuesday evening in the grocery store, when he'd followed Jessica and Chloe through the aisles. He'd watched Jessica count items, putting back cereal when the total climbed too high. He'd seen her face crumple when Chloe asked for the colorful boxes on high shelves, the ones with cartoon characters promising magical mornings. "We'll get those next time, baby," Jessica had whispered, knowing there might not be a next time. Christopher had stayed in the shadows, his own cart empty, witnessing a mother's quiet desperation. The cashier's name tag read Brenda, and her face showed the practiced indifference of someone who'd seen too many declined cards and returned groceries. She scanned items with robotic efficiency, while Jessica arranged and rearranged her crumpled bills. The formula sat between them like an accusation. 2743. It might as well have been 27,000. Jessica's fingers shook as she reached for the canister. "I'm so sorry," she began, but Christopher was already moving. "I'll pay for everything she needs." The words escaped before he could stop them. Every eye in the checkout lane turned toward him. Jessica's face went white, then red, cycling through emotions too fast to track. Chloe looked up at the tall stranger with curious blue eyes. "Are you a prince?" she asked, because in her 3-year-old world, princes appeared when mothers were sad. Christopher knelt to her level, his expensive suit creasing against the linoleum. "Just someone who wants to help," he said softly. Jessica's voice cracked like breaking glass. "I can't. We don't take charity." Her hands clutched the prescription paper until her knuckles went white. Pride warred with necessity in her expression, years of struggle condensed into this single moment. Christopher understood. He'd watched his own mother work 3 jobs after his father's death, turning away help from neighbors because accepting it felt like admitting defeat. "This isn't charity," he said, pulling out his wallet. "This is something else entirely." The black credit card slid across the scanner with a soft beep. Approved instantly, no questions asked, no drama. Christopher had spent more on lunch yesterday than Jessica made in a week. But he could see the war raging behind her eyes. Gratitude battling pride. Desperation wrestling with dignity. Chloe tugged at her mother's worn coat, asking why the nice man was helping them. Jessica had no answer for that. Neither did Christopher, not one he could speak aloud. "Not yet. Let me drive you home," Christopher said as they walked toward the parking lot. His Bentley sat alone under a flickering streetlight, obsidian paint reflecting the neon store signs. Jessica stopped walking. The gap between their worlds had never been more obvious. His car cost more than she'd earn in 5 years. "I don't think that's a good idea," she said, shifting Chloe higher on her hip. But the little girl was already fascinated by the luxury vehicle, pressing her face against the tinted windows. Christopher saw her hesitation and made a different choice. He flagged down a taxi, pressed $40 into the driver's palm, and gave him Jessica's address. which he'd heard her whisper to Chloe earlier when discussing their bus route home. "Take them safely," he said, opening the door for Jessica. She stared at him with those tired blue eyes, trying to decode the mystery of his kindness. "Why?" she asked simply. Christopher touched the photograph in his wallet, feeling the worn edges through the leather. "Because someone once helped my family when we needed it most." The taxi pulled away into the night, leaving Christopher alone with his thoughts and his secrets. Jessica pressed her face to the rear window, watching the strange benefactor disappear into the darkness. She held Chloe close, the formula tucked safely in a bag that contained more groceries than they'd had in weeks. For the first time in months, her daughter wouldn't go to bed hungry. For the first time in years, Jessica allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, someone in this world still cared about people like her. Back in her apartment, Jessica sat at the kitchen table staring at her grandfather's photograph, while Chloe slept peacefully in the next room. The stranger's kindness felt like a miracle, but miracles made her nervous. In her experience, good things came with strings attached, bills that arrived later with interest compounded. She'd learned to be suspicious of help, especially from men in expensive coats who appeared like guardian angels in grocery stores. But his eyes had been different. Not the hungry look of men who expected payment in other currencies. Something deeper. Something that looked almost like recognition. The next morning, Jessica made a decision that surprised even herself. She would apply for the community center job she'd seen posted 3 weeks ago. The Children's Development Center needed an assistant coordinator, someone to help organize programs for at-risk youth. The pay wasn't much, but it came with health insurance. Real insurance that might cover Chloe's medical needs. Jessica had avoided applying because she felt unqualified, her high school diploma and waitressing experience hardly impressive credentials. But her grandfather's photograph seemed to nod encouragingly from its frame. The application asked for references. Jessica stared at the blank spaces, realizing how small her world had become. Murphy's diner manager would vouch for her reliability. But beyond that? She wrote down Mrs. Patterson from downstairs, the elderly woman who sometimes watched Chloe for free. It felt pathetic, these meager proof points of her existence. But she sealed the envelope anyway, walking the 6 blocks to the community center because she couldn't afford bus fare. The building was older but well-maintained, with colorful artwork covering the walls and the sound of children's laughter echoing from inside. Meanwhile, Christopher had spent the night in his study, surrounded by boxes he hadn't opened in years. His father's military records, letters from war buddies who'd stayed in touch until time and distance wore their connections thin. And there, in a manila folder marked Crawford, were the documents that had haunted him since childhood. The official report of Sergeant William Crawford's death, the witness statements from the men he'd saved, the medal he'd earned posthumously, and most importantly, a single sheet of paper with an address in Millfield, Ohio. Crawford's last known residence. The private investigator he'd hired 20 years ago had been thorough, but ultimately unsuccessful. Crawford's parents had died without children visiting their graves. No marriage records, no birth certificates for offspring. The trail had ended in empty houses and disconnected phone numbers. But Christopher had missed something obvious. Crawford had been young when he died, only 24. If he'd had children, they might have been born after his death. If he'd had a girlfriend who never became a wife, who raised his child alone in a world that still stigmatized single mothers, if that child had taken her mother's name instead of a dead soldier's. Christopher made 2 phone calls that morning. First, to his company's head of security, a former FBI agent who specialized in finding people who didn't want to be found. Second, to the director of the community center, a man who owed him favors from charitable contributions over the years. "I need you to review an application," Christopher said. "Jessica Miller. Give her a chance." He didn't explain why. Couldn't explain without revealing too much, but favors were currency in his world, and he'd accumulated enough to buy Jessica this opportunity. The interview was scheduled for Friday. Jessica borrowed a dress from Mrs. Patterson, a navy blue outfit that had seen better decades, but was clean and professional. She practiced answers to questions she'd Googled on the library computer. Why do you want this job? What experience do you have working with children? How would you handle difficult situations? Her answers felt hollow, rehearsed. But when the director asked about her motivation for helping at-risk youth, Jessica's voice found genuine passion. "Because I know what it's like to struggle," she said. "And I know how much it means when someone believes in you." The job offer came Monday morning. Jessica stared at the phone for a full minute before answering, convinced she'd misheard. "When can you start?" the director asked. "Tomorrow," Jessica said, then caught herself. "I mean, whenever you need me." She hung up and immediately called the diner to give her notice. Freedom tasted like Sunday mornings with Chloe, and health insurance that might actually help. Like groceries without counting every dollar twice. Like hope, which she'd almost forgotten existed. Christopher watched from his office window as construction crews broke ground on his latest project, a children's hospital specializing in pediatric digestive disorders. The kind of facility that might have helped a child like Chloe years earlier, before her condition became so specialized and expensive. He'd told the board it was about market expansion and community relations. In truth, it was about making sure other mothers didn't have to choose between food and medicine for their children. The first wing would be named the Crawford Memorial Center, though he hadn't told anyone why. But his research into Jessica's background had hit an unexpected roadblock. The security firm he'd hired was thorough, perhaps too thorough. Their preliminary report sat on his desk like a bomb waiting to explode. Jessica Miller, born Jessica Crawford, daughter of Linda Crawford and Sergeant William Crawford, killed in action Vietnam 1971. Granddaughter of Margaret Crawford, deceased 1998. Great-granddaughter of Sergeant William Crawford, Medal of Honor recipient, killed in action 1972 while saving 12 American soldiers during the Tet Offensive. The mathematics of fate were impossible to calculate. Christopher's father had been one of those 12 soldiers. Jessica was the granddaughter of the man who'd saved his father's life. The debt he'd carried for 47 years suddenly had a face, an address, a 3-year-old daughter who needed special formula. The universe had conspired to place them in the same grocery store at the same moment when she needed help most. Christopher wasn't religious, but he understood the weight of destiny when it pressed against his shoulders. He could simply send money anonymously, set up a trust fund that would ensure Jessica and Chloe never wanted for anything. But that felt like cowardice, like trying to pay off a debt that couldn't be settled with dollars. His father had lived because of Crawford's sacrifice. Christopher had built an empire on the foundation of that second chance at life. Now Crawford's granddaughter was struggling to afford milk for her baby, working double shifts at a diner while he ate lunch in boardrooms where people complained about stock prices and profit margins. The solution crystallized during a sleepless Tuesday night as Christopher stood in his penthouse watching the city sleep below. Adams Pharmaceuticals would establish a foundation supporting families of veterans killed in action. The Crawford Foundation, dedicated to ensuring their descendants had access to health care, education, and opportunity. Jessica would be the first recipient, but there would be others. Thousands of other families carrying the weight of heroic legacies and empty bank accounts. The board would approve it because it generated positive publicity and tax benefits. Christopher would fund it because it was the right thing to do. But first, he needed to tell Jessica the truth about her grandfather, about his father, about the debt that connected their families across decades and battlefields. The conversation terrified him more than any hostile takeover or board meeting. How do you explain to someone that their entire life had been shaped by a moment of courage that happened before they were born? That their grandfather's sacrifice had rippled through time, creating the wealth that would now lift them from poverty? Jessica had been working at the community center for 2 weeks when Christopher finally found the courage to visit. He came on a Thursday afternoon when the building buzzed with after-school programs and children's laughter. Jessica was organizing art supplies in a rainbow of controlled chaos, her hair pulled back in a ponytail, paint smudges on her cheek. She looked different here, confident, in her element. When she saw him approaching, her face cycled through confusion, recognition, and something that might have been embarrassment. "You're the man from the grocery store," she said, setting down a box of crayons. Around them, children worked on projects that would cover refrigerators and make parents proud. Chloe was at daycare, the good kind that came with Jessica's new job, the kind where she didn't have to worry about her daughter's safety every moment of every day. "My name is Christopher Adams," he said, extending his hand. "And I think we need to talk." They found privacy in the director's office, surrounded by certificates and photographs of smiling children who'd found hope in these walls. Jessica sat across from Christopher, her hands folded in her lap, every line of her body language screaming caution. She'd Googled his name after getting the job, discovering his pharmaceutical company and estimated net worth. The numbers were incomprehensible, zeros that stretched beyond her ability to imagine. "I know who you are," she said quietly. "I just don't understand why you're here." Christopher pulled out the manila folder he'd carried for 20 years. Inside were photographs, documents, and letters that told a story she'd never heard. Her grandfather, as a young soldier, grinning beside a helicopter. Official reports describing his heroism during the Tet Offensive. A list of the 12 men he'd saved, including one named Thomas Adams, Christopher's father. "Your grandfather saved my father's life in Vietnam," Christopher said, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to break through. "I've been looking for his family ever since I learned the truth." Jessica stared at the photographs, seeing her grandfather as she'd never imagined him. Not the statue in her grandmother's stories, but a real person with mud on his boots and hope in his eyes. A 24-year-old kid who'd made the choice to risk everything for strangers. "Grandma never told me details," Jessica whispered. "She said it hurt too much to talk about." Her fingers traced the edges of the military portrait, seeing her own eyes reflected in his determined expression. "He died 3 days after saving my father," Christopher continued. "Stepped on a mine while leading a patrol to safety. The medal came later, but by then your grandmother had moved away. My father tried to find her, to thank her, but she'd disappeared. Changed her name, started over somewhere new." Jessica nodded, understanding flooding her face. Linda Crawford had been pregnant when William died, scared and alone in a world that judged unmarried mothers harshly. She'd taken her mother's maiden name and raised Jessica's mother in anonymity. The weight of this revelation settled between them like a bridge across decades of separation. Christopher's wealth hadn't been earned in a vacuum. It was built on the foundation of his father's second chance at life, the opportunity that William Crawford had died to provide. "I should have found you sooner," Christopher said. "Should have known Crawford had family somewhere. Should have looked harder." Jessica shook her head. Grandma didn't want to be found. She was protecting Mom, protecting me. She thought the world was dangerous for women like us. But Jessica had questions that went beyond family history. "The job," she said slowly. "Did you arrange for me to get this job?" Christopher's silence was answer enough. Heat rose in her cheeks, the familiar shame of charity dressed up as opportunity. "The interview was real," Christopher said quickly. "Your qualifications got you hired. I just made sure they looked at your application." It was a technicality, and they both knew it. Jessica had been manipulated, however kindly. Her independence had been an illusion. I can quit, she said, starting to rise from her chair. But Christopher reached across the desk, his hand briefly touching hers. Please don't. Those children need you. I've watched you work with them. This isn't about charity or pity or paying debts. This is about putting the right person in the right place. Jessica hesitated, torn between pride and pragmatism. The job was good. The kids were amazing. She was making a difference in ways she'd never thought possible. But accepting help still felt like admitting defeat. There's more, Christopher said, opening another folder. I want to establish a foundation in your grandfather's name, the Crawford Foundation, supporting families of fallen veterans. You could run it, if you wanted. Make sure other people in situations like yours get the help they need. Jessica's breath caught. A foundation. In her grandfather's name. The grandson of one of the men he'd saved, offering to honor his memory in ways that would help thousands of families. The symmetry was almost too perfect to believe. Why would you trust me with something like that? Jessica asked. Christopher smiled, and for the first time since they'd met, it reached his eyes completely. Because you understand what it means to struggle. Because you've lived the problems we'd be trying to solve. Because your grandfather chose to help people he'd never met. And I think that kind of courage runs in families. Jessica felt something loosening in her chest, a knot she'd carried for so long she'd forgotten it was there. The foundation took 6 months to establish, 6 months during which Jessica divided her time between the community center and learning the mechanics of charitable work. Christopher proved to be a patient teacher, walking her through budgets and grant applications and the complex dance of non-profit management. They met for coffee twice a week, their conversations evolving from business to personal, from formal to something approaching friendship. Madison sometimes joined them, chattering about school and pondering why grown-ups drank bitter coffee when hot chocolate existed. But not everyone approved of Christopher's sudden interest in charitable work. During a particularly contentious board meeting, Vincent Hayes, the pharmaceutical company's longest-serving director, raised concerns about the foundation's funding and focus. This Crawford Foundation seems awfully specific, he said, his voice carrying the subtle menace of someone who'd spent decades in corporate boardrooms. Are we sure this isn't some elaborate tax shelter? Or worse, are we funding Adams's personal interests? The insinuation hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. Christopher felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with being challenged by men who'd never risked anything more significant than portfolio diversification. Vincent, the foundation is completely transparent. Every dollar is accounted for. Every family we help meets strict criteria. But Vincent wasn't finished. He'd done his own research, hired his own investigators. And what about Jessica Miller, the foundation's director? Convenient how she went from serving you coffee at Murphy's Diner to running a multi-million-dollar foundation. What exactly are her qualifications for this position? The question landed like a physical blow. Jessica, sitting in the conference room's gallery section, felt every pair of eyes turn toward her. The board members' faces showed polite interest mixed with skepticism. She was the outsider here, the waitress playing dress-up in a world of MBAs and inherited wealth. Vincent's smile was predatory as he continued. I'm not suggesting any impropriety, of course, just wondering if we might have found a more experienced candidate through proper channels. Christopher stood slowly, his measured movement commanding attention from every person in the room. Vincent, let me be very clear about something. Jessica Miller is the most qualified person I've ever met to run this foundation. Not because of her resume or her connections or her pedigree, because she's lived the life we're trying to help people escape. She's raised a child on minimum wage while working double shifts. She's had to choose between medicine and meals. She understands our mission in ways none of us ever could. His voice carried the kind of authority that built pharmaceutical empires. "That's a lovely sentiment," Vincent replied, his tone suggesting anything but agreement. "But sentiment doesn't qualify someone to manage millions of dollars in foundation assets. What happens when the IRS audits us? When journalists start asking questions about favoritism and conflicts of interest? This company's reputation took decades to build. Are we really going to risk it for the sake of Christopher's pet charity project?" The word pet carried particular venom, reducing Jessica's life and struggle to something Christopher had picked up on a whim. Jessica found her voice before Christopher could respond. She stood in the gallery, her community center dress modest among the tailored suits surrounding her. "Mr. Hayes, you're right to be concerned about the foundation's management. Fiscal responsibility matters. Transparency matters. That's why I spent 6 months learning nonprofit law, grant writing, and financial oversight. That's why every decision I make gets reviewed by independent auditors. Not because I'm unqualified, but because I understand the weight of other people's trust." Her words carried the quiet strength of someone who'd earned every opportunity through pure determination. "I've read the case files of every family we've helped," Jessica continued, her confidence building with each sentence. "I know their stories because they're versions of my own story. The single mother working 3 jobs whose son needs surgery she can't afford. The widow whose husband died in Afghanistan, now struggling to keep their daughter in college. The grandfather raising his grandson alone after losing his daughter to PTSD-related suicide. These aren't statistics to me. They're neighbors. They're family." The room had gone completely silent, every person hanging on her words. Christopher pulled out a thick folder from his briefcase, the same one he'd shown Jessica months earlier. "Vincent, since you're concerned about transparency, let me share something with the board. The Crawford Foundation isn't named after some abstract military hero. It's named after Sergeant William Crawford, who died saving 12 American soldiers in Vietnam in 1972. One of those soldiers was my father. Without Crawford's sacrifice, I wouldn't exist. This company wouldn't exist. Every dollar we've earned, every job we've created, every life our medications have saved. All of it traces back to one moment of courage in a jungle 49 years ago." Vincent's confident expression flickered as Christopher continued. "Jessica Miller is William Crawford's granddaughter. For 47 years, my family has carried the debt of that sacrifice. This foundation isn't charity or favoritism or a tax shelter. It's justice. It's making sure the family of the man who saved my father never has to struggle the way they have. And if anyone in this room has a problem with that, they can tender their resignation immediately." The ultimatum hung in the air like a challenge none of them dared accept. Board members shifted in their seats, the mathematics of the situation becoming clear. Christopher Adams owned 51% of the company's stock. His word was literally law in this room. But more than that, the story he'd just told reframed everything they thought they knew about the foundation. This wasn't some vanity project. It was a debt being repaid across generations, a moral obligation that transcended quarterly reports and profit margins. Vincent Hayes found himself on the wrong side of a narrative that made perfect sense to everyone except him. "I move to approve continued funding for the Crawford Foundation," said Margaret Thornton, the board's oldest member and a veteran herself. "All in favor?" Hands rose around the table in unanimous support. Vincent sat motionless, his objection dying in the face of mathematical and moral certainty. Christopher nodded at Jessica, who remained standing in the gallery. She'd just witnessed the power of truth deployed with surgical precision, watching her story become part of a larger narrative about debt and honor and the weight of heroic legacies. After the meeting, Jessica found herself alone with Christopher in his office, city lights beginning to twinkle beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Thank you," she said simply, "for defending me, for telling them about Grandpa, for all of it. Christopher loosened his tie, the formal armor of corporate warfare no longer necessary. I should have told them sooner, should have made the connection public from the beginning, but I was worried about your privacy, about protecting you and Chloe from unwanted attention. And now? Jessica asked, settling into the chair across from his desk. The same chair where she'd first learned about her grandfather's sacrifice, where her understanding of her own story had been revolutionized by manila folders and faded photographs. Now everyone knows, Christopher said. The Foundation's origin story, your family's history, the connection between us. Some people will write articles about it, call it a feel-good story about corporate responsibility and military heroes. Others will be more cynical. Jessica nodded, understanding the trade-off. Privacy for legitimacy. Anonymity for the resources to help thousands of families like hers. It's worth it, she said. If we can help even one family avoid what Mom and I went through, it's worth every article and every skeptical question. Christopher smiled, seeing in her expression the same determination that had driven her grandfather to risk everything for strangers. Courage, it seemed, was indeed hereditary. The Crawford Foundation's first annual report documented their impact in numbers that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. 437 families supported, 68 children able to continue their educations, 42 veterans' widows provided with job training and placement, 17 families saved from homelessness. The statistics told a story of systematic change, of problems solved and lives redirected toward hope instead of desperation. But Jessica knew the real success was measured in smaller moments. Mothers who could afford their children's medications, teenagers who stayed in school instead of dropping out to work minimum-wage jobs, families who had enough to eat. Christopher attended the Foundation's first gala, watching Jessica address a ballroom full of donors and dignitaries with the same confidence she'd shown in the boardroom. She'd grown into her role as Foundation Director, her natural empathy balanced by hard-earned business acumen. The scared waitress from Murphy's Diner had evolved into a leader who commanded respect from senators and CEOs. But she still remembered where she came from, still visited the community center where she'd found her first real job, still lived in the same neighborhood where she'd struggled to afford Chloe's formula. Chloe, now 5 years old and healthy, sat at the children's table with Madison and other Foundation kids, drawing pictures of superheroes who looked suspiciously like her mother. The special formula that had once been impossible to afford was now a distant memory. Chloe's digestive issues resolved through consistent treatment and proper nutrition. She was thriving in kindergarten, making friends and asking questions about everything from dinosaurs to why some people had lots of money while others had very little. Jessica answered honestly, age-appropriately, helping her daughter understand both privilege and responsibility. During the gala's silent auction, Christopher bid aggressively on an item that caught his eye. An original oil painting of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, with the artist's proceeds going to veteran support organizations. He won with a bid of $15,000, but the victory felt hollow compared to the satisfaction of watching Jessica receive a standing ovation after her speech. She'd talked about second chances and inherited courage, about the difference between charity and justice, about the responsibility that came with remembering other people's sacrifices. Vincent Hayes approached Christopher during the cocktail reception, his earlier hostility replaced by something approaching respect. "I owe you an apology," he said, his words measured and formal. "The Foundation's work speaks for itself. Jessica has exceeded every expectation." Christopher accepted the apology graciously, understanding that Vincent's skepticism had been rooted in legitimate concern for corporate responsibility. "She's remarkable," Christopher agreed. But then, remarkable people often come from remarkable families. As the evening wound down, Christopher found Jessica on the hotel's terrace, looking out over the city where both their stories had intersected in a grocery store 2 years earlier. She'd changed from her gala dress into more comfortable clothes, the formal event transformed into quiet conversation between friends who'd shared an extraordinary journey. "Grandpa would be proud," she said, clutching a photo she carried everywhere now. The young soldier's face seemed to glow in the moonlight, his sacrifice finally recognized and honored in ways his family had never imagined possible. "He'd be proud of you," Christopher replied. "Building something lasting from tragedy, making sure his sacrifice creates opportunities for others." Jessica smiled, thinking about all the families they'd helped, all the children who would grow up with advantages she'd never had. The Crawford Foundation would outlive both of them, continuing to serve veterans' families long after their own stories ended. It was the kind of legacy that made struggle meaningful, that transformed pain into purpose. Madison and Chloe had become best friends despite their vastly different backgrounds, playing together at foundation events and learning from each other in ways that would shape both their futures. Madison was discovering what life looked like outside her privileged bubble, while Chloe was learning that dreams could become reality with enough determination and help. They represented the next generation, kids who would grow up understanding both obligation and opportunity. 6 months later, Christopher stood in another conference room, this time addressing his pharmaceutical company's research division. The topic was accessibility programs, initiatives to make life-saving medications available to families who couldn't afford them. The program would cost the company millions in lost revenue, but Christopher had learned to measure success differently. Profit margins mattered, but so did the promise he'd made to a dead soldier's memory. "We have the resources to save lives," he told the assembled scientists and executives. "The question is whether we have the will to use them responsibly." The Crawford Foundation had taught him that wealth was a tool, not a destination. Money could solve problems that had seemed insurmountable just a few years earlier. A mother's inability to afford her child's formula, a teenager's college dreams derailed by family poverty, a widow's struggle to maintain dignity while seeking help. These weren't abstract social issues anymore. They were specific challenges with specific solutions that required specific resources deployed with specific care. Jessica had moved the Foundation's offices to a building in her old neighborhood, close to the community center where she'd found her first real opportunity. The location was symbolic, a bridge between where she'd come from and where she was going. Foundation staff members were recruited from the communities they served, people who understood struggle intimately and could connect with families seeking help. The waiting room displayed her grandfather's portrait prominently, a reminder that heroism came in many forms, but always involved choosing others over self. Late one evening, as Jessica reviewed grant applications in her office, she came across a file that made her heart stop. A young mother, recently widowed, struggling to care for 2 children while working part-time at a diner. The woman's husband had died in Afghanistan, leaving behind medical bills and a family barely surviving on widow's benefits. The story was heartbreakingly familiar, echoing Jessica's own experience with poverty and single parenthood. But this time, Jessica was in position to help immediately, to prevent another family from experiencing the desperation she remembered so clearly. The Foundation approved emergency assistance within 24 hours. Housing support, childcare resources, job training opportunities, and most importantly, hope that the future could be different from the present. Jessica personally delivered the approval letter, meeting the young widow in her cramped apartment and seeing her own past reflected in another woman's tired eyes. "This is temporary," Jessica assured her. "You're going to be okay. Your children are going to be okay. And someday you might be in position to help someone else who needs it." Christopher watched the Foundation's work with quiet satisfaction, but his greatest joy came from observing Jessica's transformation. She'd gone from survival mode to leadership mode, from accepting help to providing it, from victim to victor, without losing the empathy that made her effective. The scared young mother in the grocery store had become a force for change, someone who could address Congress about veteran family issues and be taken seriously by people who'd never known struggle. On the second anniversary of their first meeting, Christopher and Jessica returned to the grocery store where everything had started. The fluorescent lights still buzzed overhead. The checkout lanes still moved with mechanical efficiency. But they were different people now, shaped by the knowledge of how a moment of kindness could reshape entire lives. Jessica brought Chloe, who insisted on buying milk with her own allowance money, a 5-year-old's gesture toward independence that made both adults smile. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been there that night?" Jessica asked, as they walked through the parking lot toward their cars. Christopher considered the question seriously. "I think someone else would have helped eventually. Maybe not immediately, maybe not in the same way, but someone would have noticed. Good people exist everywhere. Sometimes they just need the right moment to act." Jessica nodded, understanding that their story was remarkable, not because kindness was rare, but because they'd both been ready to recognize it when it appeared. The foundation continued growing, expanding beyond individual family assistance to systemic change. They lobbied for legislation supporting veteran families. They funded research into PTSD treatment and prevention. They created job training programs and educational scholarships and housing assistance programs. Each initiative traced back to William Crawford's sacrifice in Vietnam, ripples from a moment of heroism spreading across decades and touching thousands of lives he'd never know about. Christopher's pharmaceutical company had changed too, prioritizing accessibility alongside profitability. They'd developed payment programs for low-income families, donated medications to countries in crisis, and invested in research for diseases that primarily affected poor populations. The bottom line remained important, but it was no longer the only line that mattered. Employees spoke proudly about working for a company that balanced success with responsibility, that measured achievement in lives improved as well as revenue generated. Jessica often thought about her grandmother, who'd spent decades hiding from the world because she was afraid of judgment and pity. Linda Crawford had protected her daughter and granddaughter by making them invisible, but invisibility came with costs. No recognition for William's sacrifice, no support network for his surviving family, no acknowledgement of the debt that connected their story to Christopher's. The foundation made sure other veteran families didn't disappear into anonymity, that their sacrifices were remembered and honored in practical ways. Madison Adams and Chloe Miller had grown up together at foundation events, their friendship bridging the gap between their families' different backgrounds. Madison was learning that privilege came with responsibility, that her advantages were meant to be shared rather than hoarded. Chloe was discovering that dreams were achievable with enough determination and support, that poverty was a temporary condition rather than a permanent identity. Both girls would grow up understanding the weight of inherited gratitude and the power of purposeful action. On quiet Sunday mornings, when the foundation offices were empty and the city moved at a gentler pace, Jessica would sometimes sit in her office and read letters from families they'd helped. Mothers whose children were thriving in college, widows who'd found meaningful work after years of struggle, teenagers who'd stayed in school instead of dropping out to support their families. Each story was a victory against the desperation she remembered so clearly, proof that intervention at the right moment could redirect entire lives toward hope. Christopher had framed the receipt from that first grocery store encounter, the $27.43 purchase that had connected their families across generations. It hung in his office next to his father's military commendation and a photo of the foundation's first graduating class of scholarship recipients. Visitors often asked about the seemingly insignificant piece of paper, giving Christopher opportunities to tell the story that had transformed both their understanding of debt and obligation and the mathematics of kindness compounded over time. The Crawford Foundation's success had attracted national attention, inspiring similar organizations across the country. Other wealthy individuals began examining their own family histories, looking for connections to military sacrifice and opportunities to transform guilt into action. The concept of an inherited gratitude became a movement, a recognition that contemporary success often rested on historical sacrifice that deserved contemporary acknowledgement. Jessica found herself speaking at conferences and consulting with other foundations, sharing lessons learned about turning personal experience into systemic change. But the work remained personal, rooted in memory and motivated by the faces of families still struggling. Every grant approved was a victory against the desperation Jessica remembered. Every child who stayed in school was a triumph over circumstances that could have derailed their futures. Every family stabilized was proof that intervention mattered, that people could be lifted from poverty with the right combination of resources and respect for their dignity. The foundation's success was measured not just in dollars distributed, but in dreams realized and cycles of struggle broken. Years passed, and the grocery store encounter became foundation mythology, the origin story told and retold at galas and board meetings and staff orientations. New employees learned about William Crawford and Thomas Adams, about Jessica's struggle and Christopher's search, about the moment when past sacrifice and present resources aligned to create future opportunity. The story never lost its power to inspire, never became routine despite countless retellings, because it reminded everyone involved that their work was personal and purposeful and connected to something larger than themselves. Christopher Adams had started with a debt he couldn't calculate, a sense of obligation to a dead soldier whose sacrifice had made his own life possible. Jessica Miller had started with desperation, a mother's determination to provide for her child despite impossible circumstances. Their paths had crossed in a grocery store checkout line, but their connection reached back decades and forward generations, linking past heroism to present action to future hope. The Crawford Foundation was their shared legacy, proof that kindness compounds over time, and that some debts can only be repaid by helping others. And in a small apartment across town, another single mother counted crumpled bills while her child asked why they couldn't keep the milk, beginning a story that someone, somewhere, was already preparing to help write toward a better ending.